At Satchel, we strive to always make sure our schools get the best out of our system. Whether your school has just started using Show My Homework or you've already set hundreds of assignments on our platform, there's plenty more to learn. For example, did you know you could be viewing your class timetables through Show My Homework? Or how about Satchel's partnership with Collins that allows us to integrate online editions of their textbooks into our homework? Find out about our exciting possibilities and discover where you can next take homework in your school. Come see why more than a third of our UK secondary schools now use Show My Homework and become one of the first teachers in the country to be certified by the team behind the Homework Revolution. Our expert training team will be travelling the country in 2018 delivering our CPD certified workshops. We'll make sure you have all the knowledge to pass this information on when you get back to the school so that the staff can get on to the next level, saving themselves even more time and drawing even more value from the product. Visit our website at teamsatchel.com for more information on our Satchel certified workshops and find out if we're going to be in a venue near you. Satchel, together through education.
You're listening to the After School Club. My name is Rhys and our guest today is Robin Ince. I don't have a script for Robin, so I'm going to try and ad-lib an introduction for Robin. You may know him from the Infinite Monkey Cage. We were just discussing how some people know him from a DVD extra from one of Ricky Gervais's tour a long time ago. He's also got a podcast called Book Shambles, and before that Utter Shambles that he does with Josie Long. But anyway, he's an excellent comedian and very interesting.
And I turn up a day early. This is the problem. What I've actually done, for those of you listening, is I've had quite a frenetic week of being in various different countries around the world, and then I found myself in Stratford, and Rhys said, you're here now, so you are now going to find out about my background in the Canadian education system, because these are the questions he had for Tony Law. So I will now be improvising what I believe my experience might have been in an alternative universe had I been brought up in Alberta.
Yes. I mean, it's a pleasant surprise more than a shock or anything else to have Robin Ince turn up at your door, as probably some other people have discovered, knowing that his calendar isn't necessarily up to date. But yeah, I guess I've got some questions here. Hi, Tony. How's it going?
Do you know what? It's been great, and I loved when I moved from Alberta to England. Things changed a great deal for me.
Yeah, I hear you wanted to be a rock star. How's that journey going?
Well, I did briefly. I was in a band. I was in a band called the Reg Guttridge Experience, and we used to play in Finsbury Park at the George Roby pub, and then we realised that I, in particular, realised that this was not for me. I was born to be someone nattering, mumbling, and gesticulating wildly on stage with my own words, not doing covers of Adamant songs.
Are there still recordings of
Yes, and I have it. Yes, I have that recording.
Okay.
It is under lock and...
Okay, it's going to be a Terry Pratchett where you get run over it with a steamroller upon your death. No. Where did you go to school, Robin?
Well, initially I was at the village school. I was brought up in a small village, which is a village which is frequently a location for midsummer murders now, actually. Midsummer Murders and Lewis and various other things. And I was brought up, the school was literally across a gravel drive from the house that I lived in. And those were my happiest school days. The first kind of 3 years at the village school, I think was Miss Botley my first teacher. I think it was Miss Botley was my first teacher, and I really that period of my life was the most joyous time. And then when I was 8 years old, I went into the fee-paying school system, and from that point things kind of changed for me. I think by being when you arrive at school late, as many people will know, if the other people have been there for 2 or 3 years, you immediately are an outsider. And so I was with Dan Hagyard and Robert Calvert, we all had diseases named after us. So you'd be, oh no, look, here comes Ince. We'll all get Ince disease or Calvert disease or Hagyard disease. And also as a boy who did not excel at athletics due to my hypervigilance and constant awareness of my own limbs, that also meant that my disease highly potent.
Now, we are trapped in a small glass cube together doing this interview. What are the symptoms of Ince disease I should be looking at?
I think it was probably just a general wheezy malaise, I would imagine. But it was because as a school, generally at school, I don't think I would have been considered to be a high achiever. And yet by the end of it all, in terms of the actual exams I got, so I think I was quite an insular child anyway, but whether that's nominative determinism. But I found going through the fee paying system, which I was always quite sceptical of. My mate Ed, who I remain friends with, both of us, I think, quite early on found it an intriguing thing that you will have these lectures where they say, remember, you're the top 5% of the country.
And they actually do that.
Yeah, that really happens. And I think even at the age of 13, I was like, do you know what? I think this is more of a financial transaction. Yeah. And as I mentioned to you before we started recording, the actual school that I spent my final 5 years of school were in the school where Lindsay Anderson filmed If, which is a 1967 film, which is a film that kind of reflects the revolution that was in the air at the time. And it's about a revolution that takes place in the public school system.
Do you feel like you're in the top 5% of the population now?
No, I mean,
So it didn't work? It wasn't
no, I mean, in some ways I have been. I mean, one thing that cannot be taken away is that even though I may not have enjoyed a lot of my school days, there is immediately an advantage to what I had, which was smaller class size, which was a different kind of sense of attention, all of those things. And I'm very aware that, especially as, a white middle class male, that we try and go, well, haven't we all suffered? And I know that my suffering is very, very, all human beings suffer by the fact they're aware they're alive. It's a very tricky situation to deal with, but I am aware that I had advantages.
And it's interesting that you say that you were told that you had advantages as well, because I think when a lot of people think about private education, or especially kind of public school education, was it a public school? Would it be regarded as that? Yeah. They think that sometimes these advantages are implied in a way because people, or because the best kids get into those schools, and then of course they're going to end up as the smartest ones, and they get on university courses because of that name next to their or the name of the school next to their name at the top of the application. But it's interesting to me that actually in this case it was very explicit that this is what's going on. You're all here. You're going to be the leaders, presumably, of.
Well, it's kind of Francis Galton, isn't it? Francis Galton, who wrote Hereditary Genius and very much believed in the late 19th century that it was a genetic thing, that the reason that the people who went to the public schools and they went to Oxford and Cambridge, it was just innate. And I always use it as an example, I suppose, of realising how many people, often untapped geniuses that are out there. I think of my friend Alan Moore, who is a great comic book writer and a great writer generally. Watchmen and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, V for Vendetta, all of these things. And his school days were he comes from one of the less salubrious areas of Northampton. His school days, when he actually passed the exams that got him into what the grammar school was at the time, and then reacted very badly about the fact that he went from being top of the class to now being one of the people who wasn't top of the class, didn't have a great school life, and yet then left that and has become an incredibly important writer, the only person with a comic book in the top 100 novels in Time's list of the greatest books of the 20th century. And so every now and again, when I look at certain, I think we have an education system now, or not an education, we have quite often education secretaries and people in government who really have believed that they are the top people. And they are not able to pull themselves back and go, look, your existence is not the mean average of existence that human beings have.
And do you think that, part of that is also the network that ends up being put in place is that, people do each other's favours. Do you have a network? Do you
No, the only person
I've
never been back to any of the things, that I get. It's I still see my mate Ed, who went on to become a writer, and he's the only person. And it's an interesting thing. The one time that I did recently, I was out in Hong Kong with Brian Cox. We just toured Australia and New Zealand, and we did a gig in Hong Kong on the way back. And Hong Kong, suddenly there were various people who had been at my school, because of course that's where many of them went. Because if you look at where they go, it's, as you know, it's army or the financial industry or whatever. Hello, and this intriguing thing as well that is the people that bullied you at school. It doesn't mean anything in years to come to them. And this is a very... John Ronson was talking about this recently, that for those who may well have been your oppressors, now they just go, we should probably meet up for a drink. You're near where I live now. And you think, you made my life hell. For a lot of teenagers, these were the terrible moments that may well have added to all manner of social anxieties that they have now. But to the bully, it's just... I was lucky. One of the things that I try and talk about in shows that I do also is I know that I get a very broad audience. I get people in their 80s and I get teenagers. I get 13, 14-year-olds who are kind of into science fiction, whatever. And quite often I will mention the fact that to be the outsider kids at school is not... It's very tough when you're there. But when you leave it, you may well be a more interesting human being. It's highly likely.
I don't think that the expectation should really be that those bullies will now turn around and appreciate you because you're an artist or whatever. But actually, your network is going to be far nicer to live within than theirs. It's interesting. John Hodgman. I remember hearing a story from him about when he went to a school reunion, and there was a lady there who was approached by a couple of her old school bullies, and they were saying, we remember how awful we were to you, and how we must have made your life hell, and we just wanted to say sorry and wonder if you'd accept our apology. And this lady turns around and puts down their drink and says, "No, I don't," because those memories are so defining for that person. Is one of many people that person probably bullied, but it's a defining.
It's so hard though that Sarah Jane Blakemore
has
just written a book called Inventing Ourselves, which is about the teenage brain. She's a neuroscientist. And that period of time, our brains are in all manner of different forms of chaos, and as people know as well, in terms of risk taking, in terms of the fact that teenagers do know about the level of risk in risk taking, and it's very often it's only peer pressure. They've done various tests where they've basically found, doing risk-based driving games, if the teenager is just there on their own, they're quite careful to do. If they've got two teenagers behind them, so we also realise that we're not seeing people at their best at that point.
Yeah, that's also true.
There's a lovely story by John Arlott, who was a great cricket commentator and a very interesting character, and a very, very liberal, certainly by the standards of cricket commentators, and a poet as well, and a bon vivant, and a great lover of wine. And he was asked, because he'd become famous, when the headmaster of his school was leaving, they said, "Will you come and do a speech for our headmaster, for the head teacher leaving?" And he kind of wondered about it, and then he thought, yes, I will. And he had not liked him, and he had believed that he was a cruel human being. And he stood up at this event. So there is the headmaster about to retire, and the story he told, he said, "I always remember," he said, there was one particular thing that's always stayed in my mind about this man. And one day he was in this headmaster's study, and he heard the headmaster coming in, and he hid in a cupboard. And the headmaster came in, and there was a little boy shaking, just a little boy. And he had done something wrong. There was some level of minor insurrection that meant he was now going to have corporal punishment. And he talked about the way that the zeal and the delight this head teacher took in beating the child, and the welts that he left, and just the poor broken child. And he just said, "That is how I remember." And just, everyone was, "Oh my God, John." And he was like, the fact that he didn't go, "I'm now going to go into, he was always a wonderful teacher. No, I'm going to tell you this is what I remember, the cruelty." And the head teacher just left the meal, and that was it. And I thought that takes a very brave human being.
Oh, yeah.
And John Arlott was also someone who got into trouble with the BBC because he wouldn't go to South Africa to commentate. And did a great deal of work there was a cricketer called Basil D'Oliveira, who was sorry, this is not what your podcast is meant to be about, but
we're going to cut
John Arlott is another great example of, the people who taught me, I presume we're going to talk about teachers, things like that, but a lot of the people who taught me were people that I used to read about when I was a child. Being a kind of slightly outsider youth, a lot of it was reading, and I would read about people like John Arlott, and I would read science fiction, and I would read Douglas Adams, and all of these things that was a great part of my education. Though don't worry, I have got teachers I liked.
I was going to say, how much of that? I think most people tend to agree that public schools move a lot slower in moving outside of those kind of regimented ways of teaching and ways of teachers acting than state schools would. How much of that was still lingering whilst you were at school?
Well, some of the really kind of old teachers there, they're very. As a huge fan of the film and the novel Goodbye, Mr. Chips, there was a level of that there, and there were certain people though who had a different humanity. As you said, there is a level of regiment, but also someone that I had a history teacher, only for 1 year sadly because he was retiring, called Wallace Hadrill, and there was something about him where you thought, I can see the delight in your eyes even now you're approaching retirement at the way you are teaching us about the Battle of Naseby, and that you believe the subject you are teaching is an important subject to teach, and that's what I think. Certainly, there were certain teachers that stuck in my mind because I knew they weren't always the greatest at necessarily really teaching the subject, but what they gave you just that correct level of enthusiasm. I remember, when I was taught by a man called Tim Pearce, who also wrote a book about T.S. Eliot, and the way that we were taught about, I think the books that I read for A-level English were Passage to India, and I've loved Ian Forster ever since then, and Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is a remarkable, haunting novel set in Australia, in a girls' school in Australia. And there were certain teachers, or Duncan Forbes, who was head of English and was also a published poet. And there was a tremendous amount. He had was it not Forever Autumn, or August Autumn was one of the collections of his poetry. And one of his poems was all about his genitalia. And there was, what was it, a mauve toad, something like the line was something like a mauve toad sat on purple eggs, and I apologise, Duncan Forbes, I may well have misremembered, but it was, and of course you imagine the excitement of us going, oh my God, head of English has written a book of poetry, and one of the poems is all about his penis. And of course, he always seemed like quite a shy kind of man, but inside him was this. I can't remember. I wish I remember exactly how it went, but it's basically about how his genitals have instructed him to write their autobiography. So there were, and in science, there was a man called Dr. Rowan who taught biology, and he would do, not many people wanted to do this, but he would get a little minibus, and you'd suddenly find he'd take you out onto the moors, and you would spend a Sunday going to look at flora and fauna. And I think, as someone who, one of my great regrets is when I was doing, I presume this is still true, but I'm so old that I did O-levels. I think I'm the last year of people who did O-levels, and then they went on to become GCSEs the next year, so it would be 1985. And I did combined science rather than science. And that was because I did very badly at physics. I did well at the chemistry exam and well in the biology exam, but physics, because I changed schools, I entered where there was a whole year behind. I was a year behind everyone else, and I got 18%. I remember this, 18% in my physics exam. I got 82% in chemistry. God, these things stick. And so I had to, and it really disappointed me because I would love to have. And that's why now, considering most of my professional life is in some way or other communicating ideas about science or maybe philosophy or things like that, sometimes anthropology, it's odd that I didn't get the chance to actually properly study science as 3 different subjects. But Dr. Rowan was someone who did give you an enthusiasm beyond merely taking a scalpel to a frog.
Yeah. I was going to say... was it that enthusiasm that you think has carried through to your adult life and the things that you do professionally now? Do you think you still remember that as an inspiration?
No, to be honest, if I'm really honest, there is no... I know it's lovely when people have the great teacher who really inspired them and put them on their path, but with me it wasn't that. In fact, in some ways, there are people that I remember fondly, but there was no one, I think, who put me on the path. Certainly in the school education system, it was other things. It was reading, and it was science fiction, and it was watching Doctor Who, and it was things like Doctor Who. I consider still to be very important. I have a son who's just turned 10, and seeing the importance of something like Doctor Who in children's lives even now. And I went to a Doctor Who convention with him, and seeing all these kids wandering around, a little bit like Harry Potter. If you ever go to the Harry Potter world, you see various, quite often there's a lot of teenage girls dressed as Hermione, isn't it?
Yes.
And you know that she is a route for them into lots of other ideas. So for me, I think my biggest education was probably television and books.
Okay, that's interesting. And it's also one of the funny things about science fiction is they tend to be talking about the very big ideas more often than the kind of things you would be taught in O-level physics. I mean, you don't really move on to general relativity until you're relatively old. And they teach you everything and then go, oh, all of that, by the way, is wrong.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating... There's Faye Dowker, who teaches at Imperial and has been a guest on the Infinite Monkey Cage, and I went to her lecture on general relativity because I was doing a documentary about it, and that's a third-year lecture. That the first 2 years at university are still teaching those physicists the language that is required, and then by the third year they go, now you have a mastery of the language, now let's look at one of the most important ideas for us understanding the very structure of our universe.
I do sometimes think when we did I did psychology at A-level, and our teacher, Mr. Gibbs, if he's listening, he decided to structure the course in the first 2 lessons. I think he deliberately put in there what he considered being the most exciting concept in psychology, to just tie us in and then say, this is where we will end up by the end of it.
What was this? What was the most
It was Milgram.
Oh, yeah.
The Milgram experiments.
See, that's interesting, though, because now there's a lot of debate over Milgram's experiments.
I know, yeah.
But I love
But
reading
then that is
Milgram.
a big part of learning psychology, is also understanding the flaws in all of these studies that have come before and then questioning whether or not they should have. But then... But yeah, it's very strange that you get to the end of a physics A-level and they go, oh, we've got like 4 lessons left. Let's teach you how, if something travels close to the speed of light, it changes shape to match it. But it's very odd that the most exciting thing comes at the end, just before you end up leaving that course. Whereas when you're talking about things like science fiction, I mean, if people are... what was the not Gravity. What was the other massive blockbuster thing that everyone saw at the IMAX? Like Interstellar,
yeah.
Right? And the concepts explored in there about how time passes differently depending on how fast you're going and things like this. Like, they're telling you general relativity at the beginning. They're doing it on like a consumer level. And you think if you're a physics student, you only learn that 3 years into your actual course. It's I can see why science fiction might draw you more towards learning about physics than actually learning it in school.
It's great now. I mean, Interstellar, which was predominantly, and of course one of the people behind that film has now got the Nobel Prize for Physics, and Kip Thorne. And
for the film.
No,
not for the film.
I love the fact that also Christopher Nolan, he went, yeah, no, that's fine. And then there's one bit which is not accurate to our current understanding of physics, because he went, Kip, this bit is just a really great moment for the story arc. Yeah. And there is a point in filmmaking where you go, I realise this is being a little bit loose with the equations, but I still think the fact is that as an entry point, Douglas Adams as an entry point, where I was reading these things that I thought were absurdism or surrealism, and then you find out that a lot of these ideas that involve kind of quantum mechanics, it was real. It really came from those things. And Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, and his new book Artemis starts from basically thought, what would I build if I was an architect on the moon? Right. And so he's done a building project, and that was what is in it. And now he's turned it into a kind of thriller. I was talking to him recently, and it's very interesting where, he said there is a bit in The Martian. The very starting point in The Martian is wrong. The level of storm that occurs to create the jeopardy for the astronaut to be trapped on Mars, that wouldn't occur. The gravity is not there for that kind of event. So at the very starting point, he basically goes, this bit is the least scientific bit of the book.
So he does an appendum to the book where the entire story is cancelled.
Yeah.
it's 1 page long. No, and even Star Wars as well. We went to see the new film before Christmas, and it was lovely to see like little girls turning up dressed as Rey, knowing that it's not just a female protagonist, it's also that just the excitement around the idea that you can explore other planets and they have different or are completely different to Earth, and that can get people into the idea of space. It works from that level as well. I mean, we're not saying that school isn't important at all. It's important to learn those equations and learn that what the relationship between objects and things like this. And but
I would say that sometimes this is what popular culture needs to be doing, is doing the things that, I talk to a lot of teachers, of course. Teachers quite often are people, in an audience more often than not. There's going to be a few teachers. And I know that one of the problems that a lot of teachers tell me they have is the anecdotes, the emotional stories, that very often they are so limited with the time they have that they want to do those Carl Sagan moments where this whole lesson is a story of one human being's journey into discovering a new idea, or the germ of the idea, where that came from, the idea of space-time. But they have to make sure they've got to this target today and that target today. And I know a lot of them will put in the extra time to, just go, right, for those of you who want to, we're going to go after this. But I think one of the things that is often missed, not from the desire of the teachers, but from the nature of sometimes the desires of education secretaries, is stories, as we know, are very important, and they're very important in science, because the reason a lot of people leave education and believe they don't have a scientific mind, or science is something they can't deal with, is because they believe that a scientist is an alien creature that thinks only in numbers and observation. They goes, I've now observed enough to have my theory, there you go. And of course, as you know, Rich, there's an enormous, these stories of people like, Richard Feynman's work and the work of Jocelyn Bell Burnell and Marie Curie, and all of these people, their stories are not just, they don't start from some cold, analytical, Spockish moment.
And they're also just not those people. I mean, I once, I was reading Surely You Joking, Mr. Feynman. Mr. Feynman? Yeah. It's weird that he's still a mister at that point. But one of the things that I did off the back of that book was go into an isolation tank. Because they do that in South London, they have your flotation tanks, and because he tells a story about not only going into these isolation tanks to just think. I mean, was it Richard Feynman who had his solution to any problem, which is write the problem on the board, think really hard, and then write the answer on the board? Yeah, he went in there to think, but he also discovered that it was kind of it was. He was able to, because the whole point of these flotation tanks is to get rid of all feelings beside your own consciousness. He found he was able to move his consciousness 5 feet to the right away from his body. Of course, he knew that wasn't actually what was happening, but because it's only his consciousness he could feel, he was able to move it. And he said, and I went into this flotation tank after reading this page of the book, and I was like, well, that was very relaxing, and I did just think a lot, but I wasn't able to get those kind of experiences that he managed to get, and then I went back and reread it and realised I may have missed a sentence below that said, and I was able to do this with no psychological aids at all, besides a small amount of marijuana. Yeah. You think of stuffy scientists in office somewhere, not smoking a joint and then going into a flotation tank.
I mean, there's so many now. There's a book called Groovy Science, which is a series of essays about the 1960s and early 1970s, and the kind of some of the experiments that, looking back, there was a level of cruelty which I don't think related to John C. Lilly and the trying to teach a dolphin to talk, and then there's a book called How the Hippies Saved Physics, which is all about that 1960s movement where Eastern philosophy and quantum mechanics were kind of, and you can be, well, this is part of it as well, which is, the play is a very important thing to be taught. That so much of what we're doing, and so much, so many things, scientific endeavours, one of the problems we have now sometimes is that people are immediately saying, and what will be the practical applications? And you go, well, the practical applications will eventually, let's look at the history of discoveries. There's always been practical applications afterwards, but if you start off by going, we're very much, we want to get a better way of getting a fried egg off a pan, we're looking for something non-stick, and we're looking for a different way of making toothpaste malleable. Well, maybe we should start space exploration. Now, that's not the way round it happens.
Yeah. But then you also see that that the return on investment for space agencies is huge, because
it always
you
comes
end
back
up
to
discovering
that,
these
but it never
technologies,
starts off as being Colgate saying we need this,
and
so
the
we're going
problem
to send
is
you to space.
the thing that we should be arguing for is the idea that whether it's learning about art or whether it's doing physics experiments that end up in the Ig Nobel Prizes, all of this stuff is actually worthwhile in and of itself.
Yeah.
Increasing knowledge within society, within the world, is it doesn't have a monetary value, but it's the thing we should be aiming for. It's what you should be spending that money on once you've got it. And I think the move needs to be faster from what politicians and kind of high-level educators go on about, which is STEM subjects, to the new push, which is STEAM subjects. So including arts in there and recognising that not only is it things like storytelling is important to other subjects and storytelling is an art, but also that if you're talking about engineering, civil engineering, architecture is also part of civil engineering. And that is an art, If we're talking about science, designing those spacecraft, it starts off as a designer is designing products, and then they would move forward towards about that kind of aerodynamicism and things like that, and there's always an art element to designing cars and things like this. So actually, it's tied into science in a way that people don't understand.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, two things on that. But last week when I was in Toronto, I met Musha Safdie, who is an architect, and who's one of his most famous early works in Montreal. There's a building called Habitat 67, and it was built for the 100th anniversary of Canada. And he looked around at all the different ways that people were being housed, and he wanted to make something that was kind of beautiful and practical and had a level of wonder to it as well. And when I first saw it in Montreal the year before last, I did immediately go. I was with my son, who was 9 at the time. We went, wow, what is that? And he talked about the fact when I saw him last week that he very often musical architecture. He listens to music. He uses the music to. He said very often he uses Bach. Though recently he made a centre. I think it might have even been designed for a Sikh temple. And he said I didn't use Bach for the Sikh temple because that one didn't work. Bach and a Sikh temple don't work. So we found other music to use. And I think also part of that, as you were saying, the mixed. When I went to the Lovell Telescope, and when you go to the Lovell Telescope, there are various little kind of plaques on part of the structure of it, and you see the plaque which is from the foundry where the steel for the Lovell Telescope came from. And when you look at the Lovell Telescope, you see so many different levels there of human imagination that have been required to make a structure that is then able to interrogate the universe. And I think one of the things that would be great in education is to lose sometimes the specifics, is to make sure that there are always, basically what you are saying, there are always, if you are studying English literature, then why not also include some of the work of, say, someone like Alfred Russel Wallace, who wrote on many subjects and wrote on them very beautifully, and Charles Darwin. There is a literary worth to a lot of the letters and the books of Charles Darwin. If you read someone like Oliver Sacks, in fact, Oliver Sacks' final collection, Rivers of Consciousness, which came out quite recently, the way he writes about Darwin's botany is written in a beautiful literary style, but also with a pragmatic moments of scientific discovery, and why marigolds are as marigolds are, and why roses are as roses are. In the same way, when people are studying science, areas of science, I see no reason not to also include within that a small module of study of Isaac Asimov and Philip K. Dick and H.G. Wells and Mary Shelley, because I mean everyone knows really there isn't a truth in the idea of two cultures, but I still think people feel there are scientific minds and there are artistic minds. And certainly there are minds in tenacity and endeavour which mean that some people end up thriving in different areas. But you don't have to close off your mind to the other ones. When you look at a lot of art, someone like Robert Rauschenberg, a great artist of the second half of the 20th century, and a lot of his later works, he worked with technicians. He liked working in groups, and he would come up with an idea of something he wanted to do with an enormous vat of clay, and then he would meet technicians, and they would develop this thing together. And I think that mixing together, a mixture of the play ethic and the fact that it is ultimately a line that I've often used from Charles Darwin, one of his moments in his journals when he was travelling around the Brazilian rainforest, and he talked about the vivacious nature of all of the things that he saw around him, the bugs and the butterflies and the vines, and he talked about his mind being a chaos of delight. And to me, that's a major part of education, should be to enthuse. And of course, but the trouble is with class sizes and with targets all the time, this incredible element sometimes is not there. I mean, that's what the fortunate thing with the shows that I do with Brian Cox, with the Infinite Monkey Cage, is we're not trying to deliver a half-hour module on the teenage brain or on antibiotic resistance or on gravitational waves. Hopefully we will, in a period of half an hour, have 2 or 3 ideas that the listener hasn't heard before, and with luck we can approach them in a way that is engaging enough that they leave the show wanting to know more, not leave the show and go, oh good, that's gravitational wave sorted, I can now have a bar room conversation about that.
Yeah. And I think it's actually interesting looking at your shows, and anyone listening to this should check out. What's the? Have you got? Can we confirm that 9 Lessons and Carols for Godless Children is remaining in place?
Yeah, we're still doing all
cool.
of the...
So the Christmas shows called 9 Lessons and Carols for Godless People.
Sorry. Yeah, but I'm probably going to lose the godless element because it came out of a joke that is such a long time ago now. And I want to find as many ways of drawing in as many people. And in fact, it's a lovely thing. I won't go through the full background story, but it came from an argument with a religious fundamentalist on a television show. And sometimes, because it's called 9 Lessons and Carols, people of a religious bent would see tickets available on eBay or whatever, and they would buy the tickets and then go, oh no, I hadn't realised it appears it's some atheists talking about science, and they might be. And then they would actually come along, and I'd get all these letters from people saying, oh, we thought it was going to be some kind of haranguing of anyone who had a deity in their life, and actually it wasn't that, because we had other things to talk about and we had experiments to do. And that's the thing that I'm also very fortunate in, is now as a 48-year-old human being I get this opportunity to scientists say, hey, can we do an experiment on you? Can you come in? And doing the Christmas lectures with Sophie Scott, and Sophie Scott is a brilliant neuroscientist, a fantastic educator, and I'd highly, if you have not seen the Christmas lectures of 2017, they're wonderful in terms of the way of us understanding the human brain. And she gave me the opportunity to have a magnetic pulse to the left-hand side of my brain, to the motor region, which meant that I lost the power to talk. I know it seems remarkable to anyone listening that this should happen. I think she chose me quite deliberately. If it works on him, it'll work on anyone. But
we do actually have one here, just in case. Apply the magnets.
But it is, those that I know that I am fortunate in having an opportunity which my education doesn't have to stop. Yeah. And I think that's a very important part of, that thing that if you are, I was lucky enough to be brought up in a house filled with books, and that changes things. I had, again, in that list of opportunities that gave me a push that other people may well not have had in life. I went around book fairs and secondhand bookshops with my dad from a very early age, and it meant that is an enthusiasm which is why I have no depth as well. I have no depth. I could never be a scientist because my mind is constantly attracted to different shiny things.
Well, the thing I was going to say about your shows, like we say, 9 Lessons and Carols for Godless People, and then if people, the one I would highly recommend every Christmas is just the show that you do at the Hammersmith Apollo, which has gone under different names as I've seen it at different times. The last one was Brian Cox's Compendium of...
Not Brian Cox, it's Brian and Robin.
Robin.
I'm not just giving him top billing, he's got enough already. Yeah, Compendium of Reason is the title we've kept for a while now.
The thing I really like about that is that I think there's a job description that has appeared in recent years, or a job title that has appeared in different recent years, which is science communicator. The idea that you need a translator between a scientist and normal people. But actually what you do is get scientists on stage.
Yeah.
And they talk about their ideas, and they talk about how passionate they are for their subjects, and it is incredibly compelling. And what you are is a comedian who is very, very interested in science and physics. And I think that's enough as well.
Well, it's an interesting thing. Quite often when we get scientists on, we had the chief medical officer on Monkey Cage recently. She went, oh, I'm not funny, I'm a bit worried. I said, you don't have to be funny. Yeah. In the same way with the Hammersmith shows, you don't have to be funny. Interest, being enthusiastic, passionate, and having interesting stories is actually enough for an audience. And very often in mainstream culture, everything has to be whooping and cheering and laughing. And sometimes people are just leaning. When doing the arena tour with Brian Cox, where you have 10,000 people listening to a man talking about Hawking radiation and explaining the Friedman equation. And I had a lot of opportunity to look out at that audience when I wasn't on stage. They were enthralled by it, because it's even when sometimes there's a little bit of delight in going, I no longer understand what he's saying, but I believe he understands what he's saying, and that for me is enough for this particular moment. All of those things are really, and when you see someone like, when I was just saying about seeing Moshe Safdie out in Toronto, out with it was Chris Hadfield, the astronaut, and seeing the new enthusiasm that young people have for space exploration is fantastic. And a lot of that comes from someone like Chris Hadfield, because Chris Hadfield, the way that he explains what it is to be a human being leaving the atmosphere of planet Earth, returning to the ground after a period of time at the ISS, it is enthralling. And it is, and at this event, again, where sometimes it's very easy, I think, when you get caught up with social media and mass media, to become kind of melancholy and to become cynical and to believe that action is pointless. And then when I go into this other event in Canada, which is quite like Companion of Reason, and seeing Sani Payne, who is someone who is making prosthetic bionic limbs for young people using 3D printing and making them as objects from science fiction movies. So someone who has lost their hand, was either born without a hand or maybe lost it, something like meningitis, suddenly they've now got Luke Skywalker's hand. Seeing that ingenuity and seeing space archaeology, which is an incredible thing, which is these views from space that if we actually looked on the ground we would see no discoloration, but a view from space allows us to realise about incredibly intricate architecture of cities that we didn't know existed, temples that we believed were merely temples with a lot of kind of fields around them, it turns out were vibrant cities. All of these things that's why that education can't stop when you leave school. This is the problem we have, to evade dogmatism is what we have to attempt to do.
Yeah, and tying into that, you've got Chris Hadfield's videos, which people talk about YouTube holes, getting into something on YouTube and then clicking on the next one and the next one and the next one. Chris Hadfield's videos I've come back to time and time again, just going through every single one of them because they're absolutely fascinating. And he explains what's going on in such a simple way. And then obviously his Space Oddity video, which is if you have not seen that, just Google go to YouTube and search for Space Oddity Chris Hadfield, because it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. But what that is art being combined with science. He was a fighter pilot, but he's on the International Space Station, floating around, playing the guitar. When you watch it for the first time, you think, oh, it's special effects. And then you slowly realise, oh no, that's really floating there. And this is the kind of thing, this is the inspiration we need to get people into, whatever field they're moving into, whether it's the arts or whether it's science. But if you want to encourage people to go into engineering or maths or science or technology, actually the way to do it is by having arts being mixed up with that, is showing them something like this. And the idea that arts is dismissed because it's not as important. Whereas actually, if you talk to most scientists, they're not going to say, well, I was inspired to be a scientist by, looking at this amazing equation in a textbook in year 7. What they're going to say is, I watched Star Wars or, Flash Gordon or... It's
interesting, yes, science
Doctor
fiction is much that has played a big... And then for my generation, it was things like Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And then for 5 generations now, it has been David Attenborough. David Attenborough shows, there's... The awe that people have for because one, he's a very self-effacing individual, and yet his ability to communicate
to any audience as well. I was in the audience for where we first met, which is actually no, I'm not even going to say the name of the company. This isn't the BBC. I can do what I want. It's my podcast. But where I last worked, where we were doing an event for Robin. But a different event we did there was for David Attenborough, and one of the questions he got was from a I think 9-year-old girl who asked why are there wallabies in the UK, and the answer he gave was fascinating to everyone there, as well as answering the question in a way that she would understand. It was absolutely amazing. Anyway, we've talked a lot about stuff that isn't school. I'm going to ask a couple of last questions, and then we'll move on to plugs because time is pressing on. I am interested to know, you had a very... you talked about how you went to a private school. Was it a boarding school?
Yeah.
And did you board or were you a day?
Yeah, it was really... it's a strange thing. Again, Sarah Jane Blakemore was talking about this when she was talking about her book, Inventing Ourselves, which is, you're going through this enormous change hormonally, structurally, all of these things, and you're also placed in a position where, for certainly the first 3 years of puberty, I was in an all-boys school, in a boarding boys school, and it's always been, looking back, I think, wow, that was, for me, I was in a fortunate position that when I left, briefly I thought, oh my God, what if school days are the best days of my life? What if it turns out, and then it wasn't, and I had that new thing. But, so it was a boarding school, and I would never, before we start recording, I mentioned this, I would never send my son to a private school.
This was my next question, is how was your experience when you started looking around schools for your son? Was it the first time you'd been back to a school since you were at school, and how much were you worried about it because of your experience of school? And
I
what
worry
was that
a
like?
lot. I worry because I know the way that, that children are, and the kind of tribalism and all of those things. And I overly worry. I think I'm of a generation that, because we were brought up with public information films warning us about fireworks and water and rugs on polished floors, I think perhaps we're an overly paranoid generation. But I'm lucky. I live in a reasonably small town. And I've done various events at the schools and things like that, and I know that the teachers who work there are tremendously kind of committed, and also I think it's an important part of it as well that you find out when you become a parent, which is part of your job is to be involved with the school as well. The idea that you just drop them off and you pick them up. I'm lucky at the school that he's currently at. They put on events and they have like kind of camping in the school field. When Tim Peake was coming back to Earth, they had a kind of a stargazing night where everyone put up tents and all of that. All of those different ways of creating a sense of community. So school is not separate to the rest of the environment. I think is vital. But yeah, so I overly worried because we all want our children to be kind of happy and excited and interested and all of those things, and but I'm in a fortunate position where the schools around, so they're not, class size of course is always an issue, but it's not as bad as in certain areas of London. Yeah.
And it's interesting the demands on teachers having to be social workers as well as teachers, and not only make sure that, but then also the fact that the only thing actually measured for teachers is the results that they get at the end of it. As well as
size is such. There's a friend of mine who didn't really want to, but has sent his son to a private school, and he said it was incredible the change that happened almost immediately, because he went from being in a class of 30 plus to a class of 16.
Yeah.
And I think it depresses me sometimes when I see the dogmatic or Machiavellian movements of various different kind of ministers that so many things are much simpler than they seem, and to invest in education. I'm not going to stand on a soapbox, but it is to create a generation who can delight in the world, who are genuinely feel that they can connect with ideas, who want to look through telescopes and look at the rings of Saturn, all of those things, that changes the whole of your society. The ramifications that has for the streets that you walk through on a Saturday night are enormous. The ramifications that has for crime statistics, for the way that we interact with each other, for ideas of kind of sex and gender, and all of those things are so important, and yet so often they're dismissed and just turn out to be someone who comes on and goes, I'm going to make sure that all children are taught the kings and queens of England. And okay, we'll have a generation.
One Bible to every school.
Yeah, sociopaths that can win at pub quizzes may be what we end up with instead.
Yeah. Journalists that think they can do everything because they wrote an article on it. Of course, that was 2 people ago, but there's
I do. But I think
the same thing, so
sometimes that it's such health and education are.
Yeah.
They change the way that we can communicate with each other, and to create the idea that there is an equality in the worth of everyone's life is a very important part of. I've been very lucky because I spend a lot of time touring not just the country but the world, and I get to meet people from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different environments, and people who have been out in the strangest parts of the world, and I'm lucky to constantly have fed into me different pictures of possibilities.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a nice note to end on. We usually do a plugs challenge here. Now, Tony Laws is all about because I used to work at the aircraft restoration company, and his specialist subject on Celebrity Mastermind was World War II fighter planes. Now, what I'm actually going to ask of you is, which books would you recommend for children about science? It's something specific, but if there is any parents listening to this and they listen to Robin and go, well, I want my child to grow up to talk like him, when he doesn't have a magnet stuck to his head.
What age are we talking about?
Let's say, does it matter? I'm just going to say your favourite ones of any age group between
my favourite ones,
age 5 and 18.
Mentioned Douglas Adams a lot, and I think he's a great way to get into ideas. And then I think that the actually Richard Dawkins' book Magic of Reality is it's one of those awkward books that I think wasn't quite kind of right for the children's market and wasn't necessarily quite right for the adult market, but actually is a really fun book to kind of and to sit and read together. You know, I think there's a lovely thing actually. A friend of mine is a physicist, and him and his son's 15, and they still read together at night. They still have a kind of bedtime. I think that's really. They're currently reading American Gods by Neil Gaiman. You know, which is great. But I also am a huge fan of comic books, and I think comic books are a great way of getting into ideas. I mean, the Beginner's Guide, which is sometimes called Introducing, all of those comic books that have been done about kind of Einstein and Hawking and about quantum theory and about, you know, in psychology, Melanie Klein. I think Oscar Zarate is one of my favourite comic book artists, and he's been involved in some fabulous and I think comics are a great way into ideas. So I've never had any embarrassment about. I mean, in fact, I've got a Will Eisner book in my bag now called Signal from Space, which is what an imagined scenario of what will happen when we pick up the first signal from outer space. And also Carl Sagan, who I always bang on about. I think he is a great writer on ideas. And then when people are getting a little bit older, one of my Jana Levin has written a fantastic book about gravitational waves called Black Hole Blues. And before that, she wrote a book called How the Universe Got Its Spots. And she is someone who is both a practicing scientist who also has an enormous poetry within her. And the way that she describes our understanding of the universe, so I would say Jana Levin, Lisa Randall, and all of the introducing comic books, whether they're by Oscar Zarate or any of the other artists involved in that, I think they're great ways to get into it. You know, and sometimes even those books that are the kind of that start you in science by going into pop culture and kind of looking at superheroes and the science of superheroes. So there's an enormous number of them. But yeah, Jana Levin is one of my favourites, and you can read her book as someone like me who does not have a deep understanding of space time. Her book on gravitational waves is not forbidding in any way.
All right. And then if you're interested in those recommendations, I would also say I study psychology at university. If you want to inspire any kids for getting into that kind of field, we mentioned him before, but Oliver Sacks, who was a clinical neurologist, his kind of archetypal book is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Wonderful, compelling and interesting stories from him as well in that book. And you can, of course, listen to more of Robin's book recommendations on Book Shambles.
Book Shambles, yeah, with Josie Long. Not always with Josie Long, unfortunately. Josie Long was ill for our last recording, so we had to replace her with Michael Legg, but we've just done one with Stuart Lee. In fact, two parts with Stuart Lee, and we've just done one with Andy Weir, talking about his new book, and just done one with Jenny Landreth, who's written a wonderful book called, it's called Swell, a water biography, and it's about the fact that in her mid-40s, she suddenly became fascinated by swimming, and it's just the thoughts that she had while swimming and thoughts of kind of lidos and all manner of things. I mean, that's another thing that I have. What I'm lucky in is about 15 years ago I just started thinking, what do I want to exist, what would I like to make, and what would I think people might want to hear that might not be out there. And so I'm very much in that thing that if you have an idea, just try and create it. We've never had easier ways of being able to record things, film things, make your own film. You know, the level of technology is out there to create. And so if you look at something, you think, why doesn't that exist? Don't just be angry and send letters saying that you're cross, that something you heard didn't live up to your expectations. Make something yourself.
And in that vein, you've got a book to be submitting on Sunday.
Oh yeah, I have. I've got a book, which is kind of about psychology. Actually, it's what we can learn about the general behaviour of the human brain if we use the exaggerated personality of comedians as our kind of anatomical template. So I'm currently writing. In fact, the chapter I'm on at the moment is about social anxiety. But before that, I was writing about imagination.
Oh, right. So the lovely thing about podcasts, of course, is that the listener could be listening to this after that book is out. So do you have a title yet? Are you allowed to release?
It's called I'm a Joke and So Are You.
I'm a Joke and So Are You. So search for that. Do you have a predicted release?
Do you know what? I better blinking deliver it because I've missed, there's another of the great lines of Douglas Adams that is oft repeated is, I love deadlines, I like the whooshing sound they make as they go past your ear, or is it head? And I have to, so it will be out in the autumn.
Right.
Or it will never be out, and I will be going through the courts at the moment with a very angry publisher.
What else would you like to plug, if anything?
Oh no, I'm fine. Listen, I hope people enjoy the Infinite Monkey Cage. We just had a guest raven on in one about the intelligence of birds, and it was a wonderful moment where the guest raven just walked up to Brian and just looked directly in his eyes as if to say, "Who are you? You can't even fly."
Picked him out.
So yeah, and we've got a Monkey Cage book out as well that Brian and I wrote over the summer.
What's your Twitter?
Twitter is just at Robin Ince.
You on Facebook?
And if you wish to write rudely to me, I will merely ignore you. I no longer engage in Twitter spats. I try and only use it to share intriguing. I mean, that's again the thing that very often after the current show that I'm doing is all about art, predominantly about. There's a few stories about physics, but most of it is about my favourite artists and Georgia O'Keeffe and Robert Rauschenberg and various others. And a line from Robert Rauschenberg, the artist, who said, he said, "So many artists say that their art comes from their pain. Why can't it come from our joy?" And it's fantastic. At the end of every night, I always get people come up to me who are either artists and say, "I've made this thing using an idea of an image of a goat," and so I suddenly find myself again being put in all of these different loops of finding out new things. Or people come up to me and say, "You were talking about Stanley Spencer. My father knew Stanley Spencer. He went to lunch with him every Thursday," and they'll tell me these stories. That's, again, going back to the storytelling thing. It's a lovely, when you work on the scale that I work on, because when I'm not with Brian, I'm certainly not playing arenas. When you work in the kind of small theatre or art centre world, more often than not, you go to the bar afterwards and you continue your education.
And if you do want to see Robin, you can find his tour dates on his website, robinince.com. He's already completed one date in Belfast, but he's going to be touring from now, and he's going to be touring all the way till the end of June, so check him out. It will be well worth your while. So it just leaves me to say the After School Club is supported by Satchel, the team behind the UK's #1 homework software for schools. Show My Homework. To find out more about what Team Satchel can do for your school, head to teamsatchel.com. Please click subscribe and leave us a review if you like it. Follow us on Twitter. We work to the same rules as Robin does in terms of not being mean to us, please. The After School Club is hosted by me, Rhys Giles, and produced by Jack O'Leary. Our theme tune is Better at Getting Worse by Jack's band Bokito, Bokito, and you can find their music in all of the usual places. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon.